For those who don't know me, I'm Mike Seeley, the Director of the Environmental Institute, GEI. Just a reminder that we have these the first Tuesday of every month. Next month, we'll hear from Mira Subramanian, who is our visiting Barron Professor in Environmental Humanities, who's here in the front. Who'll be talking to us about some environmental issues in India. And then in May, we'll have Peter Jaffe talking about PFAS. He's in the back here, PFAS contamination and remediation. Also, as a reminder, this week we'll have another Environmental Humanities seminar organized by Rob Nixon and others. I know Rob is here somewhere. Okay. 4:30 on Wednesday. The location has been moved to Corwin, I think, right? 130 Corwin instead of East Pine, if you've been going to the seminar series. All right. So on to today's lecture, which of course is by someone all of you know, I'm sure, Rob Pringle. Rob is a professor here in the Department of Ecology and Evolutionary Biology at EEB. Works on many aspects of ecosystems, including different smaller scale parts of systems, and then thinking about how they go together to try to help to understand emergent properties and emergent behaviors of various kinds. And I took something that he probably wrote, and it says that by understanding how things work, we can appreciate them more fully and understand better how to fix them when they break. And I think that was in regard to thinking about ecosystems in general and how we might think about natural systems. He really focuses largely on natural and wild ecosystems by combining both empirical and theoretical approaches, and much of his work is focused in the African savanna regions, and today he'll be saying a bit about some of his work in Mozambique. Rob has a number of awards. I noticed that you had an award for a best thesis in American history as an undergraduate. So do I interpret then that you were a history major?
A double major in history and biology.
History and biology at the University of Pennsylvania. As I started down this road here, okay, on to Oxford for 2 master's degrees, one in economics and social history and one in environmental change and management, with another award for best thesis at the master's level. On to Stanford for a PhD in biological sciences, with various awards, including, in that case, a teaching award for excellence in teaching. And he's continued to get a number of awards, including Young Investigator Prize from the American Society of Naturalists and the Early Career Fellow Award from ESA, the Ecological Society of America. Please join me in welcoming our friend.
Thanks a lot, Mike. Good to see you all today. So, as Mike just said, the work in my lab really focuses on the question of trying to understand how local species interactions between herbivores and plants, between predators and their prey, scale up to shape biodiversity and ecosystems. And we work in a number of different systems. So we have a series of small islands in the Bahamas, 16 small islands, where we have manipulated the species present on the islands, and we're asking questions about how top predators influence the ability of prey species to coexist. We work at the Impala Research Center in central Kenya, trying to understand the biology of large mammalian herbivores primarily, and how they affect their ecosystems. And we work in Gorongosa National Park, Mozambique, trying to understand the dynamics of an ecosystem that has been heavily touched by human activity and is currently undergoing a large-scale restoration process, and that's what I'll be talking about today. All of this work is fundamentally curiosity-driven, and it aims to be mechanistic. It is contextualized to a large extent by environmental crises. But it's really, as Mike said, it's really driven by the desire to understand how they work. And it's methodologically pluralistic, as it has to be. One core of our approach is large-scale and long-term manipulative field experiments. But we also incorporate modeling, remote sensing, and techniques from molecular biology, often all in the same study, in an effort to drill down to really understand what's actually happening in these complex systems. And although the context, the context of sort of environmental issues is applicable to all these systems. In the Bahamas, we've simulated biological invasions, which are a pressing global problem. In Kenya, we seek to understand the impacts of extinction and how large animals influence carbon storage in ecosystems. And in Mozambique, it's really all of the above. But the work has variable relevance, I believe, to actually solving applied problems. If it happens, that's great, but that's often coincidental. The motivation is basic understanding. And if you want to understand how species interactions affect large-scale properties of ecosystems, there's a good reason to pay attention to the big things, especially in the context of environmental crises, because one such crisis is the decline and extirpation and even global extinction of the world's largest animals. And that can have strong effects on the structure and functioning of ecosystems. So these are examples from a extremely highly cited 2011 paper in Science about the trophic downgrading of planet Earth, the loss of animals at higher trophic levels. And they show what ecosystems look like when some of these animals, like Arctic foxes and jaguars, or wolves and wildebeest, are at low abundance in an ecosystem, on the left, absent, or at high abundance. And this is all generally, people believe this. The problem is that actually understanding these things at a deep mechanistic level is extremely challenging. And some of this work has elicited criticism because often the evidence is very literally confined to these kind of photographs, before and after pictures. For example, the story of wolves in Yellowstone and how they've changed the vegetation is very well known, but there's a lot of dispute among large mammal biologists about whether, what actually are the causes of this. There's some who contend that the fear of predation alone has moved prey out of certain high-risk areas and into other areas that they perceive as safer, with downstream effects on the vegetation. And there are others who, there's a sort of long-running arguments about whether that's really the case and how this all really works. So as I said, the world's largest animals are under severe threat. This is just, there's almost every week in these magazines and journals, there's another article with 40 authors about the fact that this is happening, and this is one of them. 3 of the world's largest animals are here: elephant, hippo, black rhino, and their historical ranges are there in blue throughout Africa, and the modern range are these tiny dots in red. And the various causes of these declines, there are several: overexploitation, hunting, displacement by human land uses, agriculture, livestock, and conflict. And today, I'm really going to zero in on 2 of these, which are actually related: conflict and exploitation. This is from a study that I did with the former graduate student Josh Daskin, trying to understand a little bit about the impacts of conflict on ecosystems. It's not something that's very well understood. And one of the first things we did is look at all the colored splotches on this map of Africa are protected areas, protected varying degrees of stringency for nature protection. And the heat map is the number of years of conflict that occurred in overlapping these areas between 1946 and 2010. Blue is 0 years of conflict, and red is 35. And what you sort of can get from this map, or from the data underlying this map is that over that span, sort of post-World War II until 2010, some conflict occurred in 71% of Africa's protected areas, and 25% of those protected areas had at least 9 conflict years. From that period obviously included a lot of anti-colonial struggles, but even if you narrow it down to just the 20 plus years from 1989 to 2010, 42% of protected areas experienced a conflict, and this is a global phenomenon. A large, many of the world's biodiversity hotspots are in areas that are conflict prone. And we found in using data that we culled from the literature, I should say that Josh culled from the literature over 3 years of hunting, that warfare conflict frequency is correlated with wildlife decline. So wildlife tend to do poorer in areas with more frequent conflicts. On the y-axis here is the lambda, the annualized population growth rate. So simply whether if a value of 1 means that population is stable, a value higher than 1 means that population is increasing, and values lower than 1 mean they're decreasing over, between 2 years. So Josh would find 2 studies that had quantified the same population in the same place in 2 different times and calculate the trajectory of that population and also the frequency of conflict in that area over those 2 years. And again, you see a similar negative trend if you just use the data from 1989 to 2010. Obviously, these are messy correlations. There's a lot of things that influence the trajectories of large mammal populations. Even in peaceful areas, you see these areas here with no conflict, you get pretty much the full gamut of population trends, disease, natural fluctuations, and so forth. But what is striking is that in peaceful areas with 0 conflict, the populations are on average precisely stable, and that almost never is there an increasing population in an area with high conflict frequency. But this was a challenging thing, a challenging piece of work to do because data are scarce. So if I ask you, where do you think research happens on this map? Where do biologists work? Where are data collected? What? You say blue? Yeah, exactly. Really, 81% of the large mammal population data are from just 5 countries. You have a lot of counts in Kenya, in Tanzania, in Zambia, Zimbabwe. These are names of countries and national parks within those countries where wildlife are frequently counted. And of course, South Africa, also Uganda. And you notice all these areas are green or blue. And we know very little about what's happening in the rest of the continent. In fact, it's even worse than that. If you just look at the number of wildlife counts in the Living Planet Index database, you see that 5 protected areas in Africa are overwhelmingly represented, those red bars on the far left. And the large number of other protected areas in Africa, we know virtually nothing about what's happening to animals in those areas. So I'm not going to talk about those places today. I'm going to talk about this place right here, this yellow, signifying an intermediate level of conflict in between 1946 and 2010. And I think some of the context for this work is that we really know very little about how ecosystems respond to this particular kind of human activity. How bad are the effects, if they're even bad? You could imagine this is not a foregone conclusion that in some areas people might, if places are too dangerous, people might leave, and that actually might facilitate recovery or conservation of biodiversity. Another question is, can these systems recover from assuming that I'll give it away. The impacts in Mozambique have been negative. Can ecosystems recover? And if they can, how? And how quickly? And then, for me, it's particularly important to think about how, by studying conflict-impacted ecosystems and their recovery, what can we learn about the basic biology of those systems that may be relevant not just to those systems, but also possibly exportable to other places. So here is, again, the place that we're going to be talking about for the rest of the lecture. Mozambique. This is Gorongosa National Park here. The core of the park is this rectangular area, and then there's a mountain that was added to the park in 2010. But we're really going to be staying in here. It is about 4,000 square kilometers, and the center of it, this is Lake Urema, and the Lake Urema floodplain is going to be a crucial, the major geographic setting of this talk. National Park was established in 1960 with a lot of fanfare, primarily because there were enormous densities of wildlife that is particularly in the Lake Urema floodplain, which is extremely productive. So you would have big herds of grazers like buffalo. This is a photograph from the PhD thesis, spectacular piece of work by a guy named Ken Tinley, who did he worked in the park as a biologist originally at the behest of the Portuguese colonial administration, and produced this just phenomenal natural history and biology of the whole ecosystem that really serves as our baseline for understanding what this system was like, not in deep history, but in recent history, immediately before the Mozambican Civil War, which was horrible. All wars are horrible. The Mozambican Civil War from 1977 to 1992 was particularly awful. Over 1 million people were killed. All the things that tend to accompany a long conflict like that, all the kinds of human suffering it's very hard to read about and hard to talk about. So I'm not really going to dwell on the human dimensions of that for this talk. I want to talk about what it meant for Gorongosa National Park. So during the conflict, the national park was really one of the main contested areas. It changed hands between the anti-government Renamo army and the Frelimo government. This is sort of immediately in the wake of liberation from there was an anti-colonial struggle that ended in 1975. Almost immediately, this civil war began in 1977, and Gorongosa was a hotspot. And during the conflict, animals were hunted by soldiers and by civilians, presumably. Immediately after the conflict, which ended in 1992, people also moved in and hunted extensively. We don't know a lot about the quantitative details of that, but we do have photographs. These are photographs taken in 1994, and it was basically just a free-for-all. People obviously catastrophically poor and hungry and protein-starved, and were very understandably hunting the animals in the park. And this led to the near extirpation of large wildlife. Here I'm talking about large herbivores, so everything from a 5-kilogram duiker up to a 5,000-kilogram elephant. And before the Civil War, so these are data from Ken Tinley's aerial surveys in the late 1960s and 70s. And you see that these black bars, which are what I'm calling the mega herbivores, elephants, hippo, and buffalo, so all things greater than 850 kilograms. These were the dominant large animals in this ecosystem prior to the war. Smaller animals, these six antelope species were also counted. So these total 9 species were counted in the pre-war era in a series of aerial surveys. And the antelopes were a lesser proportion of the overall biomass. By mid-1990s, some biologists moved in and tried to count the wildlife and found almost none. You look at the tables and there's a lot of zeros, and then a 6 and a 2. Those were the number of individuals that were seen in the immediate post-war years by people doing surveys. The top carnivores, the lions, were the only top carnivore that survived. 3 other species were extirpated. That includes leopards, hyenas, and African wild dogs. The infrastructure of the park is similarly devastated. Here is sort of what they called the hippo bar, where people would sit and look out at the Urema floodplain and the hippos and elephants grazing. This is what it looked like in 2010 or whenever I took this photo. In 2000, really a bit earlier, 2004, the Mozambican government invited an American philanthropist named Greg Carr to finance the restoration of Gorongosa National Park as a public-private partnership between the Carr Foundation and the government of Mozambique. The government's thinking being that in many Eastern and Southern African countries, wildlife tourism is a major source of revenue, and that this was one part of the strategy to get the economy clicking again. So that has been this public-private co-management agreement has been in place since 2007, and it's used a few strategies to try to revive the wildlife populations, which is, again, in the agreement between the government and the Carr Foundation, much centers on the rehabilitation of the large mammal populations and with it the sort of building of a tourism economy and various other goals that I won't say a lot about just yet. So strategy number 1 is to simply bring in animals from elsewhere in southern Africa, and this is just a list of the several species that have been translocated in from other protected areas elsewhere in Mozambique and South Africa. And the numbers are not huge. As you can imagine, this is an extremely expensive and effort-intensive thing to do, moving these very large animals long distances. And really hasn't been done very much since, in the last 5 years, with one major exception that I'll get to at the end. So these numbers are not in themselves sufficient to constitute the recovery of these populations, but they are a catalyst. The more major thing has been the we call passive rewilding. It's not really passive. It's actually very, very active. It involves things like removing wire snares set by hunters and generally reconstituting the ranger force and training them and equipping them to enforce the law against hunting in the national park. This is just a still from a promotional. There's a documentary about these rangers. There's been a big effort to recruit and train both women and men as rangers, and to instill them with a sense of professional pride and responsibility. This uniform is not for everybody. This is a special responsibility that these rangers have. So I should have explained exactly what's here. This is just a photograph I saw. I saw a truck coming back from the field with this, and the entire flatbed is full of wire snares. And this is a room in the park headquarters in Chitengo. It is you can't really tell, but I think my eye level is about here. So there's a room that is literally full to the ceiling of snares that have been taken out of the ecosystem. And these snares kill indiscriminately. They're set for game, antelopes and things like that, but they kill a lot of and maim a lot of larger animals, elephants, lions. When I first started working in Gorongosa in 2010, there were a lot of three-legged lions. Okay, there's a third recovery mechanism that I'm not going to talk about. We can do it in the Q&A if there's time and if people are interested. So since the year 2000, the turn of the millennium, and increasingly since the initiation of the Gorongosa Restoration Project in 2007, there has been a rapid recovery in the overall biomass of large mammalian herbivores. But as you can tell, the recovery is very skewed relative to the pre-war state. Whereas before, the mega herbivores were dominant and constituted the vast majority of animal biomass in the system. Currently, the ecosystem is overwhelmingly dominated by mid-sized antelopes, and in particular, one species, which I'll get to in just a second. As I'll say it now, this species, waterbuck, has increased, is now more than an order of magnitude more abundant than it was in the 3,000 individuals before the war, 60,000 roughly as of 2018. The lion population has stabilized, especially in the last few years. But as of 2016, the final year on this graph, the leopards, hyenas, and wild dogs were still absent. So we can look at the post-war recovery trends by species and see that in general, they are, all species are increasing. Zebras are not doing so well. I don't know how well you can read the numbers. These are very low densities of zebra, which were really abundant before the war, and there's just a few dozen now. So it's one exception in a generally rosy picture of recovery across all these species. But again, the differences in densities are remarkable. So whereas zebras are sort of one individual per 100 square kilometers, the waterbuck, there's 30 individuals per square kilometer on average. These graphs are just the number of individuals counted per square kilometer surveyed by air. And instead of showing each year, I've binned years within each of the intervals shown on the x-axis. So there were several counts between 1994 and 2002. We averaged those, and there's little standard error bars on top of those points. So these four species are really overwhelmingly driving things today. They account for the vast majority of animals that you would see if you were there, and the vast majority of biomass. More than 85% of the total large herbivore biomass are these five species: the waterbuck, reedbuck, impala, oribi, and bushbuck. So Gorongosa is effectively a very large-scale, very long-term experiment in ecological disassembly and reassembly. And what that means is that it's an opportunity to understand the effects of losing these animals. So we can look at how various aspects of the ecology of the system have changed as a result of the several decades of extremely low large animal abundance. And also we can now follow how things change as these animals increase in abundance. And another thing we can do is ask to what extent the sort of basic science questions that my group pursues, how does it connect with management? Again, we're not necessarily coming at this trying to find solutions to applied problems or to solve management questions, but we're very happy when those things can align. In other words, are we really useful? Are we just producing academic knowledge? Fortunately, as I mentioned, we have pretty extraordinary. Use the word baseline loosely. Obviously, a baseline is a very arbitrary concept. But as far as understanding just the impacts of the several decades of war and lax conservation law enforcement, we really have extraordinary baseline data. One is this PhD thesis by Ken Tinley, which quantified all the animals, quantified the plants in a lot of places. So we know in a really unusual level of detail what the ecosystem was like in 1972, or between 1968 and 1972, and we can compare that with what we're seeing today. And there are also other ways to get at this. So a student, same student who did the large-scale analysis of conflict effects on biodiversity, Josh Daskin, was able to find very early generation CIA satellite data from 1977. So this was when the satellite would have to take a photograph, eject a film capsule with a little parachute on it, and the plane would have to fly along, catch the film on a hook on the back of the plane, and take the film back and be developed. It was declassified by the Obama administration. Josh got a hold of it and was able to quantify the amount of tree cover and grass cover in the ecosystem in 1977, the year that the Civil War started. So here's a map of the park, and all the green pixels shown here are pixels that transitioned from grass to tree in between 1977 and 2012, by comparison with a more recent satellite image. And overall, throughout the park, there was about a 34% increase in the total tree cover, which we attribute to the decline of particularly elephants, which are very effective at killing and toppling trees and opening up ecosystems. So 34% is substantial, maybe not jaw-dropping, but there was quite a bit of variation throughout the different landscapes within the park in terms of the proportional increase in tree cover. So the way the national park is situated, let's see, where's my... here is the eastern escarpment of the Great Rift Valley, which basically peters out in Gorongosa, and this is the western escarpment. And so these are highland sort of plateaus, and this is a trough, and this is the floodplain in blue that I mentioned earlier around Lake Urema. And so this area here, the eastern escarpment, which is pretty densely forested, there was actually a slight net decrease in tree cover, really effectively no change. Tree cover was already very high. But there were more substantial increases in tree cover in most of the Rift Valley habitats, and in particular in the floodplain, which was anyway historically, still is, a very open ecosystem, a grassland, low herbaceous vegetation. And Josh's analysis indicated that tree cover had increased by more than 100%. The Urema Lake and its floodplain, various metaphors have been used to describe it. The aorta is collecting water from the rift and from Mount Gorongosa and funneling it into the ecosystem. It is also in some ways a beating heart, because in the wet season it expands, the whole floodplain floods, it's underwater, and then in the dry season it contracts. And when it contracts, it leaves behind very productive, rich pasture for large herbivores like these waterbuck. So woody encroachment and movement of trees into this landscape could be problematic for the recovery of wildlife, for the hydrological dynamics of the ecosystem, and for other reasons. One potential encroaching woody species of particular concern is a globally invasive shrub called Mimosa pigra. It's known as a giant sensitive plant because its leaves fold up when you touch it, also known as catclaw mimosa for its short recurved prickles. And this is a this is a problem in seasonally flooded ecosystems all over the world, really all over the tropics. Originally, the plant is from Mesoamerica, but it's now everywhere, including almost all of Africa. So here's a photo from Mozambique of this plant on the shores of a river. It's a major problem in Zambia. So here you can see there's an animal here, and here's this dense thicket. So these thickets can be impenetrable. In Australia, they can grow up to 6 meters tall. And obviously, if you had a major invasion of this plant in your floodplain, that's going to completely change its capacity to support wildlife and other kinds of biodiversity, large mammals and other kinds of biodiversity. It would be a major transition. The Australians spend millions of dollars trying to control this plant in Queensland and the Northern Territory. And this is just a screenshot I grabbed from the New South Wales government. You see that mimosa is a weed of national significance, and there's a hotline to call if you even see it. It's been present in Mozambique for quite some time, possibly a century or more. And in the sort of early phases of the Gorongosa project, there was already concern about encroachment by Mimosa pigra. So this is an internal park management document by the then Director of Scientific Services, Rich Balefus, outlining his concern about this plant and what he perceived as its encroachment and a management plan for trying to control it. And I just want to draw attention to a few things that he wrote. One is that he's saying we need to take urgent action to learn how to best control this plant. And he advocated various strategies, including birding, bulldozing, introduction of exotic insect herbivores to control it, and other things. And note that he says that the density of herbivores on the lake, this is 2007, Lake Urema floodplain is greatly reduced relative to historical conditions. And as of 2007, there was no evidence of significant herbivory on mimosa, which is why he felt they needed to consider all of these aggressive interventions. So in 2013, I bravely sent 2 graduate students and a postdoc to repeat Tinley's historical vegetation survey in the floodplain. And they found that the density of mimosa had indeed appeared to have increased dramatically since the 1970s. So this is the proportion of 1 meter squared quadrats in which the plant was recorded. And you see it's nearly 15% in 2013. But by continuing to monitor, we found that by 2017, the frequency, again, quadrat data here, recording presence absence, frequency of the plant had returned to what Tinley had recorded in 1972, in concert with rapid growth of ungulate biomass in the floodplain. These are the numbers as of 2018, and you see that again that the overwhelming majority of it is well, it's really mostly these 4 with a bit of these. But that is not a clincher. There's a lot of reasons why this could be a total coincidence. One thing I didn't tell you on the previous slide is that 2015 to 2017 was a drought in southern Africa. There are a lot of reasons why this is not necessarily conclusive evidence. If you're wanting to understand whether there's a causal relationship between these phenomena, you would want to know whether the animals are actually eating it. So we tried some things that didn't work very well, like putting video cameras around the neck of waterbuck. And Jen Guyton spent a lot of hours trying to record frame by frame what plants these animals eat. You see it's about to eat a mimosa plant right here. So we can tell that, yeah, they're eating it, but we couldn't really get much good quantitative data. What worked much better was a technique known as DNA metabarcoding, where we just go out and collect fecal samples. Fecal samples contain a lot of undigested plant cells. The DNA of those plants can be amplified and sequenced and then matched to a reference library of known plant DNA sequences to quantify the diet of the animal over the preceding 48 or 72 hours. And this works very well. And what we found was that this invasive plant was actually the #1 food plant of large ruminant herbivores in the floodplain. So warthog on the far left there, don't eat it. What's on the y-axis is just the estimated proportion of the plant as the overall fraction of diet, which we get by counting the DNA sequence reads. It's not perfect, but it's a good proxy. All the other species, this invasive plant accounts for between 16 and 50% of the total diet of these animals when they're in the floodplain, including waterbuck, reedbuck, impala, oribi, and buffalo. But really, the gold standard is to show this experimentally, and that's what Jen Guyton did. A recently graduated student built these fences here to exclude the large herbivores from 260 square meter plots. And over 3 years, you see dramatic growth of this invasive shrub, and there's virtually none of it outside. And it looks even better as data. And so here's the number of plants per hectare in the control and the exclosure. And here's the biomass in kilograms of invasive plant per hectare in the control and the exclosure. So altogether, conclusive evidence that the recovering large herbivores in Gorongosa are controlling this invasive plant, bringing it, they're not eliminating, eradicating it completely, but they're bringing it back to levels that are more similar to what they were historically. And importantly, this actually obviates the need for what the park was actively considering doing when we started this work, which was to spray herbicide over the floodplain at large scales. So we went management option 2. And this is an email I got from the current director of scientific services, Mark Stallmans, just saying that that in his opinion, this work is actually relevant to how they're managing the park. It's not something, and important is the second paragraph. He says, I'm using this as an example when people ask me if we have a list of defined research projects for external researchers. I like to say we don't want to be prescriptive, and precisely because we didn't set out to solve this mimosa problem for the park. We set out to understand what was happening in the floodplain, and in the process, we generated this insight, which he feels is very useful. And that is shaping how the park is approaching its facilitation of scientific research. All right. That's story 1. There's one more short story. It involves a herbivore that I haven't said very much about yet because it's really only 0.3% of the biomass of herbivores in the floodplain. It's called bushbuck, and there's a photo of one doing what bushbuck typically do, which is hide out in trees and thickets. This is the Safari Companion tells you all you need to know about large herbivores in African parks. And what it's emphasizing about the bushbuck is that it hides in patches of woody cover all over Africa. It lives in wherever there's cover to conceal it and depends on concealment to avoid predators. So we were surprised when we started seeing bushbuck out in the middle of the floodplain. And all right, this is the nocturnal animal. Some early studies say that they'll hang out in thick cover during the day, but kind of venture a little bit out at night. But these bushbuck in Gorongosa were shamelessly in broad daylight out in the middle of the floodplain foraging. So we wanted to understand what that was about. And so we put some GPS collars on the animals. That's a big one. We've gotten smaller ones since. So this is work by Justine Atkins, who's a graduate student in the department. And what we found was that what we're going to call them floodplain bushbuck or plains buck, had very different movement patterns and sort of home ranges than typical woodland bushbuck. So these woodland bushbuck are hanging out here. They creep in between thickets of vegetation on termite mounds and things like that. These floodplain bushbuck were making these big excursions out into the wide. There's no trees out here, out in the middle of the open floodplain. And what Justine figured out by looking at the historical counts going back in time was that the proportion of the population that is in this, occupying the floodplain has been increasing through time. And in fact, as of 2016, there was a higher density of bushbuck in the plains than there was in the bush. And when they're in the plains, they're eating 75% Mimosa pigra, So this is just this is again from DNA metabarcoding of fecal samples. So here's Mimosa pigra. This is the diets of the floodplain bushbuck and the woodland bushbuck. There's almost no overlap. So these animals are leading an entirely different ecological life out there in the plains, feasting on this plant, Mimosa pigra, but also eating lesser amounts of species. Like Bergia is a small forb, and so there's stuff out there for them to eat, even though there's not a lot of trees. But again, why are they doing this? So one hypothesis, and it was a favored hypothesis, strongly favored hypothesis of one of our reviewers at Science Magazine, was that they're going out there to eat the invasive plant Mimosa pigra. But that's not a very satisfying or sufficient explanation for a few reasons. Mimosa is a very protein-rich plant, but there are a lot of other plants that have, basically all of the plants in the floodplain, not all of them, many of them, most of them have higher protein content than the typical plant in the woodland. The mimosa abundance had been going down, as I just showed, but the bushbuck in the floodplain had been going up. And the mimosa was in the floodplain historically too, but the bushbuck weren't. And if food were the only reason, then they should have been. So the other possibility is that the absence of predators has caused bushbuck to lose their fear of wide open spaces, that the so-called landscape of fear has dissipated and these animals are moving out into areas that would have previously been prohibitively risky. So Justine did a really clever experiment to try to test this experimentally. And again, remember that the absence, the difficulty and scarcity of experimental tests of this idea has caused a lot of controversy in the large mammal biology community. So she went to where we knew the bushbuck home range was because they had collars on. And in the center of that area, she set up a big speaker that played leopard calls. And she also liberally sprinkled around some of this artificial lion poop called Silent Roar. And monitored the responses of the bushbuck. So she knew what the bushbuck were doing 48 hours before the experiment, and she monitored what she did 48 hours after. And what she found was that the bushbuck in both the floodplain and the woodland avoided these cues. So they moved. They didn't necessarily cut and run completely from their established home ranges, but they moved as far away from the predator cues as they possibly could. And that was basically equivalent across the two habitat types. But more importantly, she found that the bushbuck in the floodplain actually moved towards areas of greater woody cover, that the habitat use shifted back towards more typical bushbuck habitat. And this is just over sort of 48 hours of simulated predation. So we can imagine that the effects of real predators would be even greater. And we're going to have a chance to look at this because as of 2018, the wild dogs were back. A founding pack of 14 was reintroduced from South Africa. They are now upwards of 50. They've been breeding like wild dogs. And they are eating a lot of bushbuck, more than 50% of their diet in the few months after they were initially released. Like this unfortunate one here, this video does not end well for that bushbuck. And they are hunting all over the place. If you look at sort of where the dogs have collars on too, and they are moving in the floodplain, they are moving in, this is not a bushbuck, this is a reedbuck, but the outcome is similarly unfortunate for the herbivore. And so what we're expecting is that this is going to drive the habitat use of these animals back towards what they are typically throughout Africa and what they were historically in Gorongosa. And so we're going to have an opportunity to test out the results of a short-term manipulative experiment with the results of this long-term ecosystem scale experiment. So what we've learned, I think, one thing we knew already, which is that large mammals are ecologically very important. What has been impressive is that systems are very resilient. That lost ecosystem functions like invasive species containment, so-called biotic resistance to invasion, and animal behaviors and processes like the landscape of fear can be rapidly reinstated even after decades of animals being absent. Rehabilitating a wilderness is not biologically difficult. It is politically very difficult, and it is financially difficult, but biologically it is not really does not require, it does it on its own. But science really can make the management more effective and efficient. And we have a few examples of that. I discussed one. We hope we'll have more as we move forward. And I think that it seems clear to me that if you're starting from a situation like this where the large animals have been depleted and you want to bring them back, it's a good idea to wait till you bring the carnivores back until the herbivores have not just recovered to a level that they can sustain a predator population, but to a level that they're really starting to strain carrying capacity and perhaps some of the pathologies in the vegetation community can be brought under control before the carnivores start to push the herbivores back down. So the Gorongosa project is really a long-term effort, and the aim, so this is the current state as of 2017, the park here, and there's a series of private hunting concessions here and another national reserve here on the coast. The aim is to actually, and this part is now more or less completed. The park is managing this former hunting concession, and the aim is to actually create a mountain to mangroves protected area. Just heard some promising news on this front the other day that there's opportunity for Gorongosa to be involved in the management of the Maromeo National Reserve as well. Really need to thank, in particular, Jen, Justine, and Josh, who did most of the work that I talked about, and also PEI, which has been instrumental in supporting this work and supporting a large number of undergraduate interns every year who have helped us with it. Thanks a lot.
Remind you if you're leaving, if you've brought anything in with you, food-wise, please carry out your own waste. Thank you.
Maya?
Well, thanks so much for this incredible project. I was wondering in terms of the conflict aspect of it. It seems to me that it's not just whether there's conflict or there isn't, or whether there is, but also the nature of the conflict and the nature of the peace. So there was a certain type of I suppose, an ecology that was present in colonial times because of the ejection of people, or maybe that wasn't the case, ejection of people from these ecological systems. And then there was the park, and people came back in. And now we're talking about a park which again has ejected people. But do we maintain these ecosystems only by ejecting people and hope that we can continue monitoring them and policing them? And imagine that when that policing breaks down, that we'll again see a complete collapse of the ecosystem. Or is there some other way of it?
Yeah, I don't think you necessarily maintain ecosystems in the broad sense only by excluding people. I do think that you maintain this one by excluding people. It's tricky when you sort of talk about what things were like and what they're like now. Because the number of people has also increased dramatically. So what would have been a sustainable sort of level of hunting and harvesting, in the 1800, is not necessarily sustainable anymore. And the law of the land in Mozambique is that national parks there actually are people living inside the park, but they're not being evicted, they're being incentivized to move elsewhere. The other problem is as you know, in any ecosystem with elephants and large carnivores, conflicts are inevitable. And I have a whole bunch of extra slides that I won't show them all, but I'll show just one of them, which is that central to Gorongosa strategy is it's not the idea is not that that the national park is a place where sort of any kind of human activity is allowed, but the approach is very much to do everything possible to. I mean, this is basically almost more than a national park. It's a human development project at this point, and there's a very large number of initiatives that the park is pursuing to try to increase the capacity and the well-being of people in the surrounding communities. And non-trivially, this is, I would say the most important part of this is the education and inclusion of people, because in national parks in Africa, most people can't, local people can't actually visit. And so there's been a very concerted effort to try to make sure that everyone has access to this resource and to the patrimony and natural heritage of Mozambique. And that, I think, this is the long game, right? The short game is law enforcement. The long game is you embed the national park in the fabric of the society in the same way that Princeton University is embedded in the fabric of its society to the point where the trade-offs aren't perceived. And it is something the government is really very proud of. Please.
I was wondering how generalizable you think your implementation was up for this ecosystem. It seemed like the system was pretty much able to recover on its own and produce carnivores later expired. Do you think that that's generally true of completely other types of ecosystems as well, or that's kind of a lucky coincidence?
It's a good question. I think so. There's one other project that I have a lot of experience with. It's a totally different type of ecosystem. It's a tropical forest in Costa Rica, and tropical forest. We used to be told, and we used to think that if you lose it, it's gone forever. This effort in Costa Rica is basically regrowing tropical forest from scattered pastures, and it's slow. It's slower than this. Large mammals can reproduce really quickly. Trees take a lot longer, and mature forest communities take a lot longer. So there we're talking about, more than a human lifespan for the, sort of a full recovery. Even in Gorongosa, right? There's still various, wonky things about what's happening there that it's not yet. It's still very much in a transient phase of recovery. But I generally think that if when you take out the pressure, it's actually quite hard. People have perfected for millennia the art of keeping nature down. It's actually quite difficult to do it. And given a chance, I think most of these systems will recover, provided there's some seed stock, that there are things to recover it with. So, but I think I would love to see more experiments to answer that question more conclusively.
Thanks, Rob. I was curious if you had what your leading ideas were for why the herbivore community is so dramatically different now than it was prior to the conflict.
Yeah, also a great question. So we think that with waterbuck, they're able to occupy swampy floodplain areas pretty much year-round, even during the wet season, which I think makes them hard to hunt down to quite the same levels as the other herbivores. So if you model logistic growth with these populations, waterbuck are growing pretty much logistically, and as are several other populations. We think that they just simply had a head start on some of these other species. More broadly, I think that it's these antelopes have obviously shorter generation times than elephants and hippos do. So that's part of it. And then I think the absence of predators tends to favor the smaller-bodied species. So what I would expect over time is and there are some cases where similar things have happened, where species like waterbuck and warthog increase very rapidly following the removal of hunting pressure, and are gradually displaced by larger-bodied herd-forming species over time with the aid of carnivores as well. So I think all of those things are probably playing into it to some degree.
You started off talking about the trophic downgrading people from science. Can you say a little bit more about that, given everything that you've found?
Sure. I think that everything that they're arguing in that paper, that these large animals and animals of high trophic level are important for regulating populations of other species, is essentially reinforced by what we found. You know, we're not the first people to have found similar things, but I generally think that they were right about everything that they're saying there. It's just not all of the examples in ecology, especially involving some of these really large populations, are well mechanistically pinned down, and we've been trying to do that.
I was interested in whether your categorization of the, I guess it was bushbuck and woodland or open plains, was that just circumstantial? Do you think there are any real differences there?
Sorry, like real differences in terms of like genetic differentiation. Yeah, we're kind of interested in whether that might be the case. So they tend to be bigger and have better body condition on average, which we are attributing to the fact that there's just this big resource patch that they've moved out into. We've been sort of discussing whether to search for any kind of, whether that's leading to any kind of, you know, more, what might be a longer lasting sort of reproductive separation, but haven't gotten anywhere, haven't actually taken any concrete steps.
I can't imagine there's data on this, but what's the possibility that over the past 30 years of conflict with their generation time, they're less beautiful now than they were before? Like if you did these same experiments in a place with intact tigers, the result would be more extreme?
That's a great question. I don't know. What does seem to be the case is that some of these responses are very deeply hardwired, and so you know, playing I forget what the example was, but so you know, the areas where some carnivores have been, you know, extirpated for a very long time, the prey will show pretty rapid responses to some of the cues. But yeah, it would be fascinating to know more about how that actually works.
Any other questions? All right, let's thank Rob one more time. Thanks, Rob.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.